All right, so in this next chapter, chapter 8, what Steiner does is he goes back and recapitulates his historical model of the 7 post-Atlantean cultural epochs. And this is a good online map. I guess it's sold as a poster for $13. It's not bad. And how he does this is he starts talking first about the etheric body, and then he'll lead. Here's the Atlantean flood. So he says that there was a flood that wiped out Atlantis, and that Atlantis existed somewhere to the west of Ireland. Maybe. Doubtful. Very doubtful. But in any event, he starts by saying first, though, before he gets to this, he says, now consider the fact that the subtle body, you have the physical body, then animating that is the etheric body, then giving waking consciousness is the astral body, and the human being has an ego. And these subtle bodies, these upper 3 subtle bodies, are in the physical world, though you can only see them through clairvoyant perception. I would also add that you can see them using hallucinogenics. I saw a man's subtle body once doing psilocybin mushrooms. I could very clearly see his chakras, his meridians, iridescent colors shifting inside of him. So it can also be seen that way. But he says, so with regard to animals now, animals have these same lower 3, the physical body, the astral body, and the etheric body. They're all in the physical world, but they don't have egos in the physical world. However, they do have egos. It's that the group soul of the animals exists in the other world, in higher worlds. So they have group egos that animate them, but that group ego is not down here on the physical plane the way that the human ego is. So he says, if you imagine the etheric body of a man, it's pretty much it pretty much coincides exactly right now with the actual physical form. But it didn't used to be that way. And he says, if you look at a horse, and you could look at a horse with clairvoyant perception, you would see that its etheric body, especially around the head, extends quite a bit further outward from the actual physical body of the horse. And he says an elephant is even more grotesque looking with respect to its etheric body. It's quite a bit larger than the actual elephant itself. And so he says the human beings during the Atlantic period also had etheric bodies that, or rather had their etheric bodies with the head part of it, what later becomes the aura, or the halo, rather, in Christian art and in Buddhist art, was it extended out like a halo, the etheric part of the head, and it gradually over time withdrew. And in withdrawing, human beings lost their ability to communicate with the gods directly. So he says, we didn't always used to have religion because human beings didn't need religion during the Atlantic period. Because what would happen is that during the daytime, their day consciousness was very murky. They couldn't. The world looked to them the way a city looks during a fog, not very clear to them. But at night, when their astral bodies left their physical bodies, they could see with perfect clarity into the spiritual world. I had this experience once with a drug, actually. I think it was mirtazapam that a doctor put me on once a long time ago as a mood stabilizer. This was many years back. And I remember that the effect of the drug was to create intensely vivid dreams that I could remember with lucid clarity, but that once I was up for the rest of the day, I had a very dull, foggy consciousness. So it was weird how it did that. So what Steiner's talking about is something analogous to this. And then he says eventually, so what happened with the etheric part of the head withdrawing and becoming pretty much coterminous with it, as it is nowadays, there was a loss of clairvoyant abilities and an increase in clarity of waking day consciousness. And then he says that in the future, we will have both. We will have the clarity of the waking day consciousness that we have, and we'll also have that nighttime clarity of being able to look into the other world and see spiritual realities there. I would also add, though, that we now know that this is possible through regressive hypnosis. Psychiatrists can use hypnosis on their patients so that they can not only remember past lives, they can also remember exactly what they did, said, and thought in the life between lives, as Michael Newton calls it. So we have nowadays we have a pretty vivid and clear picture of what the other side looks like. It has gotten clearer and clearer and clearer. The more, to me anyway, the more I have studied and investigated these reports, it looks pretty clear. And Steiner came close. The way that he describes the other side is not that far off from the way it actually is. He came pretty close. So he did have some kind of clairvoyant abilities. There's no question about it. So let's look then at his historical model, which I think is extremely problematic, though fascinating to consider as a myth. And I think a myth is exactly pretty much what it is. So he's got this Indian. So what happens after the flood is that these initiates, Manu in particular, who's the Indian flood survivor who corresponds to Noah, or Atrahasis in the Sumerian tradition, who is named Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. These flood hero survivors are echoes of real beings, according to Steiner, who led people from west to east after the sinking of Atlantis. And they went as far east as Tibet. And as they went along, they founded these spiritual colonies. And so he's got this ancient Indian civilization, 7227 BC, lasting to 5067 BC, which is about the length of one of the, during the precession of the equinoxes, it takes about 2100 years for the precession to move through a complete sign. And here with the Indian, it was the sign of Cancer. I've studied Indian Neolithic civilization pretty well, and there just isn't any evidence for any kind of sophistication during this time. India was up and running as a bunch of farmer mud hut villages with clay figurines. I don't find any evidence of yoga there. As Steiner asserts, I just don't see any correlation there with reality whatsoever. But note that, so these 2,000-year epochs actually straddle the signs as it precesses backwards through, and it takes 72 years to precess backwards 1 degree from Cancer to Gemini to Taurus to Aries. Now we're at the tail end of Pisces, and we're going to move into Aquarius. And so these civilizations straddle. It's interesting to look at this model in Herta von Dation's very excellent book, Hamlet's Mill, where she talks about the how all these ancient myths contain astronomical allegories and symbolism. But here on the end paper to the hardcover edition, the softcover edition doesn't have this for some reason. But, I wish it did, because it's a very helpful model that shows the precession moving along from 14,000 BC through Virgo. It takes a while till it gets to Leo, about 10,000 BC, when Leo starts coming in here. And I suppose this is what leads hacks and dilettantes like Graham Hancock to say that the Sphinx dates from 10,000 BC just because the precession was moving into Leo, even assuming Leo was up and running as a constellation, which is highly doubtful at that time. And then Cancer. So his model starts with Cancer. Here it is, 7227 to 5067, was it? Would straddle Cancer. And the only thing that really corresponds is that this is the beginnings of human domesticity. This is when villages start springing up all over the place, although actually they go back closer to 12,000 BC than 7,000. But it is a period of what's called the Pottery Neolithic, when there's pre-Pottery Neolithic A, which is, I think, 10,000 to 8,000 roughly. Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, which is 8,000 down to about 6,000. And then with 6,000, we get the Pottery Neolithic. Pottery is up and running. And there is a shift. The culture is different in the Neolithic. The Neolithic of the Middle East, it's very different. The worship of the ancestral dead basically fades away. There was a skull cult that was connected with that pretty much fades away at most of these sites, as separate cemeteries are built for the dead instead of just burying them, as was the case at Çatalhöyük and a whole bunch of these sites, burying the dead under the sleeping quarters, so that you would actually be sleeping above your dead grandmother, let's say, because they had a very cozy relationship with the dead. They were the elders. And the dead always say no to innovation. It's their job to conserve the past. And so this whole civilization of the Neolithic took forever to unfold for precisely that reason. But once about 6000 BC, with the pottery Neolithic, the dead are out of the way, things begin to speed up pretty quickly until by the time we get to 3500 BC, the procession has moved through the Gemini, which is kind of interesting looking back here at Steiner's model, because he's got the Gemini corresponding to an Ur-Persian civilization, which develops not basic soul dynamics, this is wrong, which develops the astral body. India develops the etheric body, which does have to do with memory, and India has been primarily an oral culture that is incredibly good at memorizing texts and passing them on from the guru to the disciple, and the disciple will have to memorize, an entire text, the Panchatantra, let's say. And so we've got the dualism of the Persian civilization with the war between Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. That does sort of correspond to the symbolism of the Gemini, the dualism of the Gemini. And then with the Egyptian Mesopotamian coming in here, he's got 2900 BC, which is about right. Now we're within the bounds of historical reality here. Right about 3000, 3500 as we see the precession shifts into Taurus. And both Egypt and Mesopotamia are packed with bull symbolism everywhere you look. Just think about the Gilgamesh epic and the slaying of the bull there. That's all up and running for the Egyptian civilization. Then we get the procession down to the time of Christ, when the procession moves to the vertical fish of Christ. And then as the West unfolds, it moves to the horizontal, which is interesting. According to Carl Jung in his book Ion, talks about the shift from the vertical axial emphasis between the spiritual world and the earthly plane to the rise, the disintegration of the heaven archetype and the rise of the earth archetype. So that by the time you get to the Renaissance, there's a very strong interest in the earth and earthly things, earthly matters. The orientation becomes more horizontal. Let's look back at Steiner's model. So he's got the sentient soul being developed by the Egyptians, and that has to do with thinking in terms of mythological images. Everything is very lush and vivid with this, sensual imagery everywhere you look. And this corresponds, of course, to Jean Gebser's, in his book, The Ever-Present Origin, to his mythological consciousness structure coming in here. And to Arnold Toynbee's first generation of civilization, which is the Egyptian and Mesopotamian together both, along with their two satellites, the Harappan civilization, which is about as far back as you can push high civilization for India, 2500 BC, same period for Minoan Crete, which is a satellite of the Egyptian civilization. And so that's the first generation. So the sentient soul is developed, and then it moves into the Greco-Latin civilization, where the intellectual soul is developed. That corresponds nicely with Gebser saying the mental consciousness structure comes in now with the Greeks. And this is also Karl Jaspers's Axial Age, when we get prophets everywhere across the board. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Yajnavalkya brings yoga back and teaches it to the Brahmins in 800-ish. And Christ ultimately is the outcome. Karl Jaspers puts the cutoff point for the Axial Age at 200 BC, but I think he should have pushed it down to the time of Christ, because Christ clearly is a prophet in the tradition of the prophets that begins with Elijah. And indeed, it was thought that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah. And Steiner says that's actually literally true. Elijah did literally reincarnate as John the Baptist, and that same individuality later reincarnates as the painter Raphael during the Renaissance, and then again as the German poet Novalis about the year 1800-ish. So this is the axial event comes in with Christ as the being descending from the sun, the Christ being, that descends into the sun, and the physical body of Jesus receives this being and proceeds on his ministry for 3 years, performing miracles and healing and all kinds of stuff before he's crucified. But it brings in the I am. What Steiner has been saying all along is it brings in the I am, which sunders the individual from the group soul. So that has been the goal all along here. And then we've got the development of the consciousness soul, also sometimes translated as the spiritual soul of the West. Coming in 1413 AD is the date he gives, which is also with his angelology, the time that the angel Gabriel assumes rulership, who is an archangel. There are 7 archangels. Gabriel comes in and presides over. Gabriel is the angel who presides over communications, all forms of writing. The printing press comes in shortly thereafter. Then we get the information revolution of the 19th century with, starting with the telegraph, eventually the telephone, then radio, and on down to the internet. And this is the development of the I, the ego, to quite a level of sophistication that the earth has never seen before. This development of the consciousness soul, which is the sense of I will things, I make things happen. That's what the consciousness soul does. It's the center and core of a sense of free will that had to be developed. So reincarnation in the West, which was anathematized at the Second Council of Constantinople in about 554 AD, it was necessary to anathematize it so that the West could then carry on its karmic task of creating the sense of the individual self, the ego. And the earthly plane comes in. Now, Steiner says an interesting thing here in this chapter when he's talking about there is a certain resonance between the Egyptian civilization and our current, what Spengler calls Faustian civilization or Euro-American civilization, in that the emphasis on the physical world with our civilization was prepared by the Egyptian emphasis on embalming and mummifying the body. They took very special care to mummify those bodies to the degree to which sometimes we can reconstruct what those individuals look like because they've been so perfectly preserved. And that interest in the physical body and the attention on it prepared the way, because when those individuals, us namely, when we went back into the astral world and reincarnated, whatever, I'm sure there were plenty of incarnations in between, but by the time we get to incarnating in today's present Euro-American civilization, we have that it's been prepared beforehand by the Egyptian interest in, you might say science, but that would be the wrong word, but the interest in the magical efficacy of the physical world. And sort of a mixture. The Egyptians sort of bring the astral into the physical and mix them in a way that had never really been done before, with their incredibly sophisticated science and technology. And that prepared the way for what is happening in Faustian civilization with its conquest of the earth and the shift in Pisces to from the vertical fish to the horizontal fish, from the heaven archetype to the earth archetype. So now what needs to happen is what will happen is the gradual development of the spirit self with a Slavic civilization. This will be Russia. This will be Russia's task as it emerges. It's, according to Spengler, it's a newborn civilization. It's just now entering into its springtime. It will straddle the latter part of Pisces and move on into Aquarius. And it will develop the spirit self. And the spirit self is the transformation of the astral body. What happens is that the ego works upon the astral body, and it does this naturally anyway across the incarnations, but it can be accelerated by forms of meditation, yoga, concentrating on the astral body, because the astral body is what makes us basically animals, passions, desires, the sex drive, all these sort of irrational, impulsive behaviors come from the astral body. And so when the ego does work on it, either automatically through the incarnation process or individually, you get a better behaved person. You get a civilized, mature human being, not some criminal running around slitting people's throats. That is a person whose astral body simply has not developed into the spirit self yet at all. And then eventually the ego will work on the etheric body and transform that into the life spirit, and then eventually work on the physical body will transform that into the the spirit body. And here this individual has war of all against all at the end of history here, 7893 AD. I'm not sure where this individual has gotten this. I have not encountered it yet in any of my readings of Steiner. But anyhow, that's what he talks about in this chapter.